My name is Lorraine, and at 72, I thought I had already lived through every kind of story life could write for me. I had faced grief, embraced love, endured the loneliness that comes with loss, and carried the quiet routines of widowhood, as if they were the only rhythm left for me. My late husband William built this cottage in Vermont more than 40 years ago, and every wooden beam, every creaking floorboard, every familiar corner holds his memory. After he passed away 11 years ago, I convinced myself that I could keep living here without him, carrying on quietly with my books, my garden, and the occasional phone call from my children who had long moved away. For a long time, I thought my story had ended with Williams. But I was wrong. It was an evening like any other when the moment that changed everything happened. I had been painting in the small studio William built for me decades ago, a space that had been dormant for years. Brushes sat dry in old jars, canvases leaned against the wall like forgotten dreams, and jars of pigment dust gathered light like relics of another life. For years, I had been too afraid to return to painting because it reminded me of the woman I used to be, young, vibrant, unburdened. But something inside me stirred that day, and I picked up a brush again. I painted until the sun sank, until my body ached, and until I realized how alive I felt. When I returned to my bedroom, I shed my paint-stained clothes without much thought. The window was open, letting in the cool Vermont air, and I felt exposed yet oddly free, standing there in my skin, just as I was. I wasn't thinking about anyone seeing me. I wasn't thinking about vulnerability or shame. I was thinking only about the strange and undeniable fact that for the first time in years, I felt real. That was the moment he walked in. It wasn't anyone scandalous, not a stranger or a forbidden guest. It was my neighbor's son, who had been helping with odd jobs around my cottage for the past few months. He had come by unexpectedly to return a set of tools he had borrowed from the shed. He opened the door with a polite knock I hadn't heard, and there I was, completely uncovered, startled but not embarrassed. For a moment, time froze. His eyes widened, then quickly shifted away. He apologized, nearly stumbling over his words, and backed out of the door. But the damage, or perhaps the awakening, was already done. In that instant, I realized how much of my life I had lived covered, hidden, protected by layers of grief and silence. I realized that I hadn't felt seen, not truly seen, for more than a decade. It wasn't about him, or about attraction, or about anything forbidden. It was about me. I was standing there as myself, stripped of everything I thought I had to hide. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't ashamed. That moment didn't end in scandal or laughter or judgment. It ended with me sitting down on the edge of my bed, taking a deep breath, and deciding I could not go back to living as if I were invisible. Something had to change. In the days that followed, I thought about it constantly. Not about him, but about myself. About how far I had drifted from the woman William once loved. The woman who once painted until her hands were stained, who danced barefoot in the grass, who laughed too loudly at her own jokes. I had buried that woman along with my husband. And yet, she was still here. She had been waiting all along. I began to paint again, every morning. At first, it was clumsy, awkward, as if my hands had forgotten the language of color and form. But soon, the flow returned. I painted my memories, William's smile, my children's laughter, the autumn fields behind the cottage, the light that fell across the bed where I once lay dreaming of a future that seemed endless. Each stroke was a release, each canvas a confession. With painting came other awakenings. I called my daughter, whom I hadn't spoken to in weeks, and told her I loved her without reason. I wrote letters to old friends I had long neglected. I went to town wearing a scarf William once adored, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was clinging to the past, but carrying it proudly. The moment I stood uncovered in my own home taught me that vulnerability is not weakness. Vulnerability is the purest form of truth. It reminded me that my story isn't finished, that my life isn't something to endure quietly until the end. It is something to live fiercely and unapologetically. Weeks turned into months, and I found myself changing in ways I didn't expect. I began hosting small gatherings in my cottage again, inviting neighbors over for tea, sharing my paintings, and letting laughter fill the rooms that had been silent for too long. I reconnected with people not because I was lonely, but because I finally wanted to share myself again. Evenings became sacred. I would sit by the window with a glass of wine, looking out at the fields, and I would feel William there, not as a ghost of loss, but as a presence cheering me on. He had always believed in me more than I believed in myself. It was as if in that moment of unexpected exposure, he had reminded me through sheer coincidence that I still had more to give, more to create, more to live for. Now when I think back to that night, I don't think of embarrassment. I think of freedom. I think of how strange it is that sometimes the most accidental, awkward, or startling experiences can become the turning points of our lives. I think of how much I had been hiding, not from the world, but from myself. I wasn't wearing anything that night, but I also wasn't wearing fear, or grief, or silence. And for the first time in years, that was exactly what I needed.